So the first level of racism, institutionalized racism, is the kind of racism, it's the system. It's the structures, policies, practices, norms, and values that taken together result in differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. So this is the kind of racism that does not require an identifiable perpetrator, because it's been institutionalized in our laws and customs and background norms. We see it in terms of material conditions and in terms of access to power. It shows up as inherited disadvantage and its reciprocal inherited advantage. So differences by race in terms of access to quality housing, excellent educational opportunities, equal employment opportunities, and the like. Differential access to medical facilities, including linguistic access. Differential access to a clean environment, and the very well-documented disproportionate placement of toxic dump sites or bus depots in communities of color, or using the Pacific atolls for nuclear testing, or what they now call the uranium mining in what they call now in the Indian country the wastelands where you can't even farm, so all of that. And in terms of access to power, power is information, which can be medical information, health information, or even information about our own histories. Power as resources, not just capital resources, but social networking resources, and power as voice in government, media, and the like. And sometimes I have this slide up and people say, Dr. Jones, this is one of those where people will raise their hand. And they say, excuse me, Dr. Jones, this has been all well and good, but look at that set of examples where you talk about housing, education, employment, and income. Isn't that what we call social class? Why do you have that on a slide about racism? Are you talking about racism, or are you really, really in essence talking about social class? And especially, I would say in public health, there are many people who have this very sincere question. Here, I'm sure too. I'm going to answer that question. The first part of the answer is the observation that it doesn't just so happen that people of color in this country are overrepresented in poverty while white people in this country are overrepresented in wealth. That is not just a happenstance. For each marginalized or stigmatized or oppressed group of color, there's been some initial historical injustice. So for American Indians, it was the taking of the land, and the near genocide, and then moving survivors to reserve lands, reservations, and then in some cases something good was found under one reservation. Oops, you gotta pick the people up and move them somewhere else. You know, there were people who lived for centuries in Mexico, never crossed the border, right? Border crossed them. They found themselves in New Mexico and all of these other, Arizona, California, here we are, right? And yet their great-grandchildren are being harassed, right? And even the fact that we are using, migrant labor in the way that makes Georgia farmers crazy. Who's going to pick our strawberries, right? Even while they're not attending to the health or pay or anything else. Those things. Even Chinese laborers were brought here centuries ago to build our railroads, unable by law to marry and unable by law to bring their families. Here, especially, Japanese, the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, without the concomitant internment of Italian Americans or German Americans. Did you ever think about that? Right? For people of African descent, one of the initial historical injustices was the kidnapping of West African people and our importation across the Atlantic, the tremendous loss of life in the Middle Passage, right? And then for the survivors and their progeny for generations, what I describe as the coerced usury of our unpaid labor for centuries to build this country. And then some people go, oh, but Dr. Jones, there you go, talking about slavery. Right? Dr. Jones? We all recognize that slavery was an unfortunate chapter in our nation's history. Right? But Dr. Jones, the enslaved people were emancipated by 1865, and we're in 2018. That was 153 years ago. So all else being equal, don't you think the impacts of slavery would have washed out by now? But the key phrase is in their question, all else being equal. And all else has not been equal since 1865, and all else still is not equal today. And there's still what I describe as contemporary structural factors that are perpetuating that and all these other initial historical injustices. And these present-day contemporary structural factors are part and parcel of institutionalized racism. So when somebody asks me, are you talking about racism or are you really talking about social class? My answer is that institutionalized racism explains why we even see an association between social class and race in this country. That is a very important aha. Then people say, well, Dr. Jones, all this talk about racism, you don't really care about poor white people, do you? And I say, au contraire, I do. I care about poor white people, poor black people, poor Latino, Hispanic people, poor Asian people, poor Indian people, poor everybody, right? And we need good anti-poverty strategies. Indeed we do. But this is the caution. If this magic wand would eliminate poverty across this land today, I would certainly use it. In fact, I'd go farther, I would eliminate income inequality. My husband and I disagree on that, but I think we could flatten the whole thing out to good use, right? But if I did that without addressing the background structures, policies, practices, norms, and values, the mechanisms of institutionalized racism that are deeply embedded in the fabric of our nation and were put in place to differentially shunt different populations to different possibilities, even if I flattened the whole thing out today, if I did that without addressing institutionalized racism, in 20 years, in one generation, we would start to see a stratification by race again in terms of income. This is not an either-or proposition. This is a both-and. And before I get off of institutionalized racism, one more thing, which is that institutionalized racism can be through acts of doing, acts of commission, as well as acts of not doing, acts of omission, and very often institutionalized racism shows up as inaction in the face of need. The second level of racism, personally mediated racism, I define as differential assumptions about the abilities, motives, and intents of others by race, and then differential actions based on those assumptions. So this is what most people think of when they hear the word racism. Somebody did something to somebody. It includes the different idea, the prejudice, and the different action, the discrimination. So this is, many people call this interpersonal racism, or just plain racism, is what most people think of. I call it personally mediated racism because I'm still understanding racism as a system, and this is the system mediated through people, right? But this is, there's a lot of interest now in implicit bias, unconscious bias, and all that's all in here. How can it impact health? Well, I'm not going to go in detail on any of these, but police brutality, physician disrespect, I'll just say that can be as subtle as a physician not giving a patient the full range of treatment options. Because the physician figures that patient wouldn't understand, couldn't comply, couldn't afford, whatever it is. Or it could be blatant, like sterilization abuse, which has had many iterations in our nation's history. Shopkeeper vigilance, being followed around in stores, or waiter indifference, not getting quick, respectful treatment. These are just two examples of what some people call everyday racism, the microaggressions, the subtle communication of disrespect that might be related to elevated blood pressures in communities of color, where blood pressures don't even go down at night. Teacher devaluation, feeling, a teacher looking at a young child and thinking that child can't learn. And then putting that child off in an ADD track, that child won't even know their full potential, much less have the opportunity to develop to their full potential. Like institutionalized racism, personally mediated racism can be through acts of doing, acts of commission, as well as acts of not doing, acts of omission. But even more important on this level is that it can be unintentional as well as intentional. You do not have to have intended to do something racist to have had a racist impact. So important to understand. The third level of racism, internalized racism, here I'm defining from the point of view of members of stigmatized races, as acceptance by members of stigmatized races of negative messages about our own abilities and intrinsic worth. Now, I've been talking about this for a long time. I have many friends who do anti-racism training who have asked me, what about the internalized sense of entitlement that many white people walk around with? Isn't that also internalized racism? And I agree. Yes, it is. I still haven't put it on my slide, even though I have more insight now about how that could turn into bad health outcomes, because maybe it's related, maybe a sense of entitlement thwarted is related to suicides, maybe it's related to the opioid epidemic, although it's not just an internal thing, where there's prescribing practice and all of that. Maybe it's related to people voting against their own interests, which we haven't seen the full impact of that yet. But I don't have that part on the slide. So this is from the point of view of members of stigmatized races, where internalized racism shows up as self-devaluation. People feeling, maybe I'm really not as good as, maybe I shouldn't try to graduate from high school or apply to that college or try to get that job or live in that neighborhood. The white man's ISIS culture syndrome, that phraseology actually comes from my parents' generation. And what it meant then for people of color, it still means for many of us today. So say I'm black and I need a lawyer. I might actually go seek out a white lawyer over a black lawyer. Or if I'm sick, I might prefer a white doctor over a black doctor. In fact, if my Gatorade were warm, I might go way down the street to get the white man's ice over the black man's ice, deeply believing that the white man's ice is colder, deeply internalizing the myth of white superiority. It turns into resignation, helplessness, hopelessness, which turns into a lot of self-destructive health behaviors. And really at its core, it's about members of stigmatized races accepting the limitations to our own full humanity of the box into which we've been placed. So that when you hear young high school students of color, and I understand you have some very good programs that are partnered with the schools here in San Francisco, and when you hear young high school students of color teasing one of their friends of color who's trying to be the valedictorian by saying, oh, well, so-and-so is just trying to be white, we need to challenge that. Because since when did white people claim exclusive access to excellence? They did not. So now I'm going to illustrate this story with